Novara FM now has its own dedicated inbox. You can write in with your questions, comments, criticisms and quibbles to fm@novaramedia.com. That's fm@novaramedia.com. Thanks for listening.
On the 1st of May 2007, 700 police officers in 3 countries kicked down 32 doors and dragged dozens of activists screaming from their beds. Operation Achilles, named after ancient Greece's famously indomitable warrior, summoned the combined strength of several states to defeat what seemed like an unstoppable political force, the animal liberation movement. Though at least a century old, the movement experienced a resurgence in the mid-1990s when a group of UK activists decided they wanted to end the practice of vivisection, or operating on live animals for medical and commercial testing. Wielding placards of deformed puppies and screaming monkeys hooked up to electrodes, these anti-vivisection activists ran a series of targeted campaigns against laboratories across the UK, and with incredible success. Consort Bioservices, shut down. Hillgrove Family Farm, shut down. Shamrock Monkey Farm, Regal Rabbits, Newchurch Guinea Pig Farm, all shut down. And that was just the warm-up. In 1999, the resurgent animal liberation movement set its sights on the biggest and most powerful animal testing laboratory in Europe, Huntingdon Life Sciences, HLS for short. Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, or SHAC, pursued the lab with a ferocity rarely seen in social movements before or since. The group was famed for its use of secondary targeting. It went after not just HLS itself, but its accountants, lawyers, shipping companies, and clients, everyone even remotely connected to them. So regularly did SHAC protest in the City of London to pressure HLS's shareholders to divest that city workers began becoming informants to SHAC, and the Met had to write to their employers asking them not to leak financial information. Even the letter was leaked. By the early 2000s, it seemed like the state's crackdown on SHAC was floundering. Shares in HLS had plummeted from £1.13 to 17p. So low that the company was dropped by its stockbroker and moved to the Seats Plus Lonely Hearts trading system on the London Stock Exchange. HLS was dropped by its insurer, even its bank. SHAC was within a hair's breadth of winning, and the state knew it. Fearing humiliation, and fearing for its Science Minister Lord Sainsbury's stock portfolio, the state did what it does best: protect private property. Having already spent millions on funding police protection for testing facilities, Tony Blair's government, sometime critics of animal testing, decided the fun and games were over. Following Operation Achilles, 16 SHAC activists were sentenced to a combined 80 years in prison, and a direct action group The Guardian once dubbed the most successful of its kind in the world was effectively destroyed. But if the anti-vivisection movement has all but died, its tactics live on. Palestine Action sees itself as the direct heir of SHAC and has had similarly runaway success through its adoption of secondary targeting. Palestine actionists are also currently on trial for blackmail. It's only the second time the charge has been used on activists. The first was the animal liberation movement. I'm Rivka Brown, and on today's Novara FM, I'm joined by Tom Harris, author of Your Neighbour Kills Puppies, Inside the Animal Liberation Movement. A former hunt saboteur, Harris joined SHAC the year it was founded, aged just 16. 10 years later, he found himself in HMP Winchester on blackmail charges, serving 2 years of a 5-year sentence. He maintains his innocence to this day. We talked about what made the late 90s and early noughties so ripe for animal liberation activism, the truly unbelievable lengths the state went to protect private companies, and whether human beings can be free unless all beings are. Tom Harris, welcome to Novara FM.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So there will be some people who are listening to this who might think that while it's unfortunate to test animals, it might be necessary to test them, particularly to manufacture things like medicine. Why did you become opposed to animal testing? And what kind of treatment are we actually talking about when we talk about vivisection and testing on animals?
So my personal journey into it, it actually came from the meat industry, and then I learned more and more about the way we oppress other animals. And so for me, it really is entirely just the ethics of exploiting others for our own benefit. So I'm personally opposed to all research on an ethical stance, but scientifically it is really a redundant science, and it's probably the only field of science that refuses scrutiny and testing and rigorous inspection. And throughout the history of the modern animal liberation movement and the anti-vivisection movement, one of our biggest asks has always been for an independent inquiry into the efficacy and ethics of animal research. And like several governments have promised this, and actually the events in my book, a lot of it was inspired when Labour reneged on that promise. And every time that it's promised, the pharmaceutical industry, the vivisection industry pulls together and really scuppers any chance of it. They lobby against it and they quash it. So I think everyone should be asking why this is one field of science we're not allowed to question. And yes, it includes pharmaceuticals, but it's also pretty much any toxic substance, so paints and paint strippers, or Splendor, the sweetener, was tested at Huntingdon Life Sciences, glue or agrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, and refrigerant coolants. Kind of any kind of toxic product is really tested.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people who were sort of adults in the 90s, and at the time we're talking about when the vivisection movement was kind of going through this massive resurgence, will probably remember, documentaries like Channel 4 exposing what was going on inside some of these testing facilities. But for people, particularly younger audiences for whom vivisection might not be such a live issue, can you tell us a bit about some of the ways that animals are treated in these facilities?
Of course, I think a lot of people I speak to don't even know it still happens, and particularly on primates and dogs and other large mammals. But the experiments can really be anything. Like, as long as a license is granted by the Home Office, then the experiment can go ahead. The licenses are granted on a level of suffering caused, so it's mild, moderate, or severe suffering. It's very rare for a license to be refused. And so whatever ideas that either university researchers come up with to test a new idea, or contract research organizations such as Huntingdon Life Sciences, now LabCorp, where they're testing toxic products for private companies, pretty much anything they think of can be used. So, things like shaving animals and pouring, bleach or whatever toxic product directly into their skin, putting it into the eyes of rabbits because rabbits can't blink or produce tears. There's a lot at the moment where people are having pig hearts very unsuccessfully transplanted, and that has been tested. That was tested again at Huntingdon Life Sciences. They were putting baboon hearts into pigs. Pig hearts into baboons. And in those experiments, Huntingdon broke the law 526 times, stitching surgical equipment inside animals and leaving animals to die and get infected and all kinds of horrible things. So really anything, the worst things you could imagine might happen inside an animal testing laboratory, I can kind of guarantee are happening inside an animal testing laboratory.
So your book, which purports to be about the animal liberation as a movement as a whole, is actually about quite a specific period. It spans from the sort of late 1990s to the early 2010s. So it begins in 1996 when a 28-year-old Derbyshire boy named Greg Avery launches this kind of quite small campaign against an animal research lab named Consort Bioservices in this tiny town called Ross-on-Wye. And then it ends very climactically in the late 2000s, early 2010s, with dozens of activists in 3 countries being sort of handed 80 years worth of prison sentences. What's particular about this phase of the animal liberation movement, which, as I'm sure you know, has been around since, at least the sort of late 19th century?
I think really what the SHAT campaign, Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, it really was the kind of almost the convergence of the movement and the apex of it. And where the success of their campaign really inspired the government. It certainly inspired other actors, but it inspired the government to, in their words, eliminate our movement. And that's exactly what they did. And so I think it shows that the power of the individual, it shows the power of that kind of collective organising and autonomous organising and what it can achieve. But it also really marked the end of a long period of the animal liberation movement, really from the 1960s to the 2010s. It kind of came to a very dramatic and abrupt end in the events of this book.
Yeah. The book is not just about this kind of specific period, but really the precursors to some of the campaigns preceding Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, particularly campaigns against the lab I mentioned, Consort Bioservices, and then after that shut down, Hillgrove Family Farm, and then it was SHAC, and that was the group that kind of really predominated in this period and became the main target of state hostility, I guess. So yeah, can you just explain why these smaller campaigns against Consort Bioservices, Hillgrove Family Farm, culminated in SHAC, this campaign against Huntingdon Life Sciences?
So the Consort campaign was aimed at closing down a breeder of dogs for research, much like MBR Acres is still doing in Cambridgeshire today. And when Greg launched that campaign, along with Heather, they really decided to take this kind of bold new stance of not just protesting a company, but actively trying to close them down, which they proved to the world and to other activists and to themselves that they could do. And so then they moved on to Hillgrove Farm, as you say, which bred cats for research, and they successfully closed that down. And what that did is it really inspired a wave of other campaigns that, other activists recognized the power of this model, and they started campaigns against Newchurch Guinea Pig Farm, Shamrock Monkey Farm, Regal Rabbit Farm, and all of those campaigns were also successful. And so I think what Greg and Heather, and by this point Natasha as well, what they wanted to do was take on a larger target. And in 1997, Huntingdon Life Sciences had been infiltrated by two separate investigations, which showed just horrific exploitation and oppression and violence towards other animals. There was, puppies being punched in the face and primates being slit open without anesthesia, and just a litany of violence. And, a lot of it was illegal. A lot of it wasn't. A lot of it was just what was in their project licenses. And it.
But even if it was illegal, am I right in thinking this was the same case where a couple of the laboratory workers who were convicted, who were found guilty of terrorising animals, were given some ridiculously sort of lenient,
a slap on the wrist. They were given a slap. Two of them were given a slap on the wrist because they had to, because I think this is one of the first instances of footage coming out of a laboratory, and certainly a British laboratory. And it really, everyone was watching. It was on, prime time Channel 4. Millions of people watched this footage and saw what was happening. So the government had to do something. So they suspended Huntingdon's licence very temporarily, then gave it back, and they began the xenotransplantation test, in which they broke the law another 500 times.
What's xenotransplantation?
That's the putting organs from one species into another. So that was pig hearts into baboons. So really, the government had to do something, but they did very little. And a lot of Huntingdon shareholders and customers were horrified, obviously, and probably more so concerned about their PR. And campaigns started, which started pushing these shareholders and customers away from Huntingdon. So Huntingdon's share price plummeted. And kind of looking objectively and kind of the lessons they'd learned from Consort and Hillgrove, Greg and Natasha and Heather recognised that actually all that was needed to close down this multinational company was to convince their bank to withdraw their loan and cancel their bank account, and that would close the laboratory. And so it kind of looks, I think, it looked like kind of hubristic naivety, these kind of young activists thinking they could take on a multinational company. But actually, it was just a case that they were going to go after the bank and convince them to pull out, which they did, and they did. And unfortunately, that was not the end of the story.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, it was interesting that it got to kind of that point of sort of lobbying the bank to let go of HLS as a client, because the sort of earlier phases of Greg Avery's activism, which I think you sort of focus on him in the beginning of your book, because he sort of spearheads, as you say, this quite militant and relentless style of animal liberation activism, where a single target, a single farm, a single lab is sort of selected, and endless protests will be held there over weeks and months until they shut down. And so okay, many years later, you've got them targeting NatWest, but back in 1998, you describe a confrontation on World Lab Animal Day at Hillgrove Family Farm between police and protesters that is, you describe it as being reminiscent of a medieval siege. Can you tell us just a bit? Because I think it's quite, incredible, actually, some of these kind of scenes that occurred and some of the militancy of these protesters. Can you describe that particular standoff or any of the kind of confrontations that feel most memorable to you as examples of that militancy, of that spirit?
Yes, I wasn't at Hillgrove. I think I was 14 maybe when that happened. So unfortunately, I missed that protest. But where really that came from was the live export campaigns in the mid-1990s saw really a wave of radicalization where statistically it was predominantly middle-aged women seeing trucks of animals being transported through their little quaint seaside towns off to be slaughtered on the continent. And it invoked this sense of outrage that radicalized people and saw mass protests, quite radical protests on the street, and people who hadn't been historically active before. Middle-class people that in many cases hadn't been active before. They then started getting involved in this movement. And when BSE came along and the live exports temporarily paused, they were looking for, other causes to get behind. And that, by chancery, that's when Greg started the Consort campaign. And so they kind of got behind that. And there was this kind of rising wave of grassroots militancy. And so, the Battle of Hillgrove, as the press and the police dubbed it, it was 2,000 people turned up at Hillgrove Cat Farm, where cats are being bred for research. The investigations and animals that are being rescued from there. The cats were eating each other. They were in just horrible conditions. Like many of his staff, Farmer Brown's staff, had left, reporting horrific abuse and horrible conditions. And so people turned up at this farm, 2,000 people, to protest, only to find the police had barricaded the way there. And when they finally got through, stop and searches and, forced videoing and forced searches, they finally got to the farm only to find it had been surrounded by these 10-foot high militarized metal barricades all the way around the farm with police watchtowers every few meters along it. And, the police had erected a special a telegraph pole thing so they could get communications to the site. And it was reminiscent of some kind of dystopian fortress. And people turned up angry at being stopped by the police, angry at being delayed by hours to get there. And they got there and found they couldn't even see what they were protesting against. And people got upset, people got angry, and people were determined to try and get some cats out of there. And the police were determined to stop them. And it became, quite a exciting scene from all accounts.
Yeah. It's funny that you describe it as exciting, because there were some scenes that I felt like were quite exciting or quite thrilling. Like there's one in which a shack activist, obviously this is later because Hillgrove Family Farm precedes it as a campaign, but she talks about getting in a police chase after going to the house of the brother of the Huntingdon Life Sciences managing editor, Brian Cass, and bricking his window. And then she drives as fast as she can, cranks up the stereo. It sort of just seems like something out of Fast and Furious. Do you think there was something, particularly for these kind of young activists that, as you say, were getting politicized at this moment, that was exciting about being part of such a cinematic kind of campaign?
I think a bigger part of it was just that people inspired each other, and it felt like a campaign that was going to win, which I think can be quite a rare thing. I've been around the progressive left for over 20 years, and it's quite rare to be involved in a campaign where you're certain and the people around you are certain of victory. And having that kind of buzz and that feeling, it really made everyone, I think, throw everything into it, because this wasn't just screaming into the wind. We were making billionaires cry, and politicians were losing sleep over what we were doing, and it was really empowering. And I think that's why, as the campaign went on, we became active on every inhabited continent on Earth. And, you have to ask, why were kids in Russia risking getting assassinated, in some cases, by security? And that was a very real fear for them. Why were they doing that? To protest a laboratory in the UK? Why were people in Mexico planting bombs in Mexico City? for a campaign in the UK. And it's really because there was just real buzz around it and just this real feeling that, victory felt inevitable. And what we discovered was this model that seemingly could be used to close any business on earth. And it was certainly something the government were terrified of. And, I remember the Financial Times once reporting that we were succeeding where Karl Marx, the Baader-Meinhof gang and the Red Brigades had failed. Which, I don't think that was our intention.
Such a good quote.
I don't think that was our intention.
I hope it's framed somewhere in your house.
It wasn't our intention for sure to necessarily take down capitalism. I'm sure we wouldn't have been that sad if we had, but certainly I think that's what the government feared, that other people were going to start replicating it because it was effective and it did, it really inspired something in people.
So we've talked a bit about the sort of early, very militant sort of campaigns against Hillgrove Farm and some of the other sort of the guinea pig farms and the cat farms that you mentioned. And then we go for the kind of the big guns, HLS, biggest animal testing facility in Europe. And already at the point where Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty starts up, kind of on its knees, share price in tatters, its stockbroker had abandoned it to the point where it was in the kind of Lonely Hearts section of the stock exchange. And so this was kind of going to be the sort of final nail in the coffin. It seemed like such a sort of winnable fight. And also, I think what's really interesting is that the establishment seemed to be turning against HLS as well. The Labour Party, the ruling Labour Party at the time, had divested its pension fund from HLS, the reputation of the company seemed to be in tatters. What happened then to suddenly make the establishment switch and be like, this company, which we're going to allow to die, no, actually, we're going to pour all our resources into saving it. The government opens an account for HLS at the Bank of England, the first private company that, to have it done for them in history, and then pours millions and millions of pounds into stopping what appeared to be a sort of foregone conclusion of HLS closing down from happening. Like, what changed?
I think this is really where the story starts getting almost larger than life. And, if I hadn't lived it, it seems almost fantastical. But really, this is where our own Bond villain steps in. It was a guy called David Sainsbury's who, as his name suggests, was part of the Sainsbury's family. He was born a millionaire. He'd invested in biotech, which included animal research, GM research. And he donated £2 million to Tony Blair's Labour Party, the new Labour Party, almost as soon as they were elected. And then within a few months of that, he was given a seat in the House of Lords. He always denied there was a connection. I'll leave that for him to deny. But within a year of getting that seat, he was then appointed Minister for Science, so completely unelected. It's similar to David Cameron being Foreign Secretary now, completely unelected, but given a seat because he was a Lord and possibly given a lordship because he was very generous.
Well, later resigned in the Cash for Honour scandal.
And resigned during the Cash for Honour scandal, still adamantly insisting that there was no connection to
and that Tony Blair just happened to go from saying that he was going to start a royal commission into animal research and suddenly changed his tune and started calling animal researchers decent people doing legitimate jobs.
Exactly. And Lord Sainsbury, he was, from that position, he did a lot to increase the profits of companies he was connected to around the animal research field. And he clearly devoted himself to eradicating, in his words, eliminating the anti-vivisection movement. And so that was a huge part of it. And really, he was the reason. So when the NatWest Bank and Royal Bank of Scotland, when they divested from Huntingdon Life Sciences, when they recalled their loan and closed their bank account, it was now Lord Sainsbury's who stepped in and he secured them banking through the Bank of England, which hasn't been offered to any other company before or since. And he found them an anonymous American lender to fill in the missing cash. And they didn't stay anonymous long. We found out who they were very quickly, but that was all Lord Sainsbury's. So we had him on one hand, and on the other hand, we had the pharmaceutical industry who had been already having secret meetings with Tony Blair around trying to make the UK more amenable to their industry. They had pressured the government into lowering taxes for the pharmaceutical industry, cutting red tape on getting licenses for animal testing, making it easier for the NHS to refuse drugs based on price, and a bunch of other fairly underhand things. And all of this under the threat that if the government didn't do things to make the UK more favourable to the pharmaceutical industry would leave the UK and potentially trigger a recession. So those two things, Lord Sainsbury's on one hand and this threat of a recession from the pharmaceutical industry on the other, really, I think, drove Tony Blair and particularly really Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor and who pinned his entire 2001 budget around research and development, which at the time animal research played a huge part of.
It is also, in some ways, characteristic of the British state and the police in particular to protect the interests of private companies, right? Like, it's so stark, the amount of resources that local police forces and the state poured into policing these protests, hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds into, erecting barricades and effectively building fortresses around, sometimes quite small individual businesses just to sort of protect them from, from activists trying to liberate, some beagles sort of thing. A lot of the time there wasn't kind of criminal damage. It was really just like get in, get the cats, get out kind of thing. And it also feels, relatively consistent with a historic pattern of the state doing as much as it can to protect, private companies against protesters who aren't necessarily even doing anything criminal except, protesting against the criminal activities of a company.
Yeah, I mean, the police don't exist to protect the public. They exist to protect profit. It's very overt. If you ever go on any protest for any cause, if the police show up, they'll go immediately into whatever company you're protesting against and talk to them and get their side first and see what they want done with you. They won't ever come up to the protest and see what you want done about whatever terrible thing the company's doing, whether it's legal or not. So the police in this country do not exist for the benefit of the people of this country. And that's never been the case. And they sometimes they don't get as involved in this case because the science minister was directly involved, because Tony Blair was concerned about the pharmaceutical industry divesting from the country. They threw everything into it. And, obviously the police forces involved, they were getting multi-million-pound budgets to deal with this, which meant they could buy all this fancy equipment and they could do all these fun operations, investigations and all the rest of it. So that they were quite happy to be receiving millions and millions of pounds. So, so they were happy to keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have a sort of good analysis of like the police's sort of role, like politically, but were you at all surprised by how much the companies and their employees could get away with? Like, there are some examples that you give of things that happen to shack activists or to animal liberation activists that just seem like so incredible. There's just two that I've got here. One is when a farmer that was targeted appeared to have used a nerve agent called dimethoate on some grass to poison protesters who were picketing his home, causing them breathing difficulties, diarrhea, vomiting, and mouth ulcers. Police took no action. Then on Hillgrove Farm, an employee's neighbour or friend reversed his car over a shack activist. No arrest. Were there things in the course of your kind of interviews for this book or your own experiences that shocked even you?
There's certainly things in the book that shocked me, and I got involved in activism as a fairly young teenager. So I think I grew up with a fairly strong and personal understanding that the police were not my friends and they weren't going to protect me, and in many cases they would seek to harm me. So in that regard, I don't think I was ever that surprised. I think the level of the kind of deep state operations did shock me, because I think it's important to kind of recognise that we are, or at least we view ourselves as a nation of animal lovers. And I think that's broadly true. We're the birthplace of the RSPCA, which is the first animal welfare organisation in the world, the birthplace of the Animal Liberation Front, the vegan movement. So I think, it's a fair thing that most people believe that we're a nation of animal lovers. And most people in this country, I think, are at the very least uncomfortable with the idea of animal testing. And so to convince that public that it's okay to drag, youth activists in many cases from their beds and throw them into prison for really long prison sentences, you have to weave a very convincing narrative that somehow they're the bad guys, that these protesters, and kids in many cases, are the bad guys in this. And that's really like a lot of what this was. There was a huge kind of narrative building around us being extremists and terrorists and, you know, terrible people that would stop at nothing for our like crazy idealistic aims. And we were, you know, threatening the country and all the rest of it. And so with that kind of narrative being built consistently throughout my involvement in this movement and specifically this campaign, I think in a way we almost started to gaslight ourselves. And certainly, you know, most of the radical left abandoned us. And so when you know, the later events transpired, when the government decided that we were going to be eliminated, we had no support. And I think a lot of us started to believe that, you know, there was some kind of basis behind this all beyond just greed and money. And so kind of researching the book and kind of coming back at it a little bit more objectively and with the kind of distance of time and kind of recognizing that, no, actually, this wasn't about what any individuals were doing. This was just about shutting people up. And it didn't actually matter. And as you know, as you get towards the end of the book, you can start realizing that people are doing less and less in terms of radical action, but still receiving the same response from the police, to the point that people who are organising all of their protests with the police and, you know, attending the protest with a parameters of protest guide, telling people how they should and shouldn't act on the protest, and, you know, disclaimers in the newsletters and websites, they're still getting rounded up. They're still getting sent to prison.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting when you compare some of the tactics that you outline in the book, like people scaling, you know, laboratory walls and, like, I mean, in the case of the Animal Liberation Front, which is obviously different, like taking much more kind of extreme action. And then you compare that with some of the actions of let's say like climate activists today who are doing like slow marches and scaling bridges and like generally like low key compared to some of the stuff that you guys were doing, which was extremely confrontational and, you know, in some sections violent. Like, the demonization is just like off the charts. And I guess I wanted to ask a question about a potential turning point there. Like, you know, actually, that after 9/11 in 2001, the kind of USA arm of SHAC, because as you say, it had gone global by this point, it was on every inhabited continent, began to be compared to terrorists. So this is like where we start to have terrorism applied to sort of like, you know, social justice movements, really. And there was one leader of SHAC USA who was banned from even being in London during the royal wedding, visited by police before the 2012 Olympics. Obviously, then 4 years later, we have the 7/7 bombings in London. I wonder whether those events and the sort of war on terror that they triggered changed how the police and the state treated you.
I mean, absolutely. And I think anyone that was active in any form of protest at the time will attest to that. I recount in the book, actually, my first protest after 9/11. And it was, you know, it's just a few days after. And it was outside some bank who were a shareholder in the laboratory. And, you know, we'd been going there regularly. And it was, I think I was probably maybe 18. And I was with a couple of my friends who were like 16, 17. And we were just stood outside the gates, as we had every single time, like doing exactly what we'd always done, being annoying, but just kind of, you know, having a fairly light-hearted protest. And the police showed up, and this cop just walked up to me and just kind of hovering his hand over his truncheon and was just, you can't do this anymore. And he didn't elaborate, and like his attitude didn't really make me want to push what he meant, whether he meant we couldn't protest anymore or we couldn't stand in the road, or but it changed, and his attitude was so different from what had come before. And it did feel like, you know, he was saying like, protest is over. And that's how it felt. And as you say, you know, this label of terrorism started getting bandied around, not just in the USA. It was being raised in Parliament here. We were being called terrorists. I think one particularly sensational member of the House of Lords asked when we were going to be brought into the war on terror as much as the hypothetical terrorists of Al-Qaeda, whatever that means. So yeah, it was an eye-opening experience for sure. And I think at the time we found it so absurd, like so mind-bogglingly absurd, that I think we kind of tried to laugh it off and kind of took it in our stride. And, you know, the police were certainly helping build this climate of fear that they attributed to us, but actually the police were probably doing more than we were to scare these companies by, you know, calling us terrorists and kind of labeling, you know, these mad things. And, you know, most of us were just people going on peaceful protests, and we were being compared to terrorists. And so, yeah, I think we kind of we joked about it. We made kind of whatever a meme was before a meme was invented, but we used to make little images and send them to each other of like people in protest, like being labelled as terrorists and stuff. And
probably for the best that you were operating in the pre-social media
yeah,
age.
possibly. I mean, I feel like we'd have bigger numbers, but probably more infighting. But yeah, so it was a turning point. But I think the biggest turning point was the intervention of Lord Sainsbury's with the Bank of England and bailing Huntingdon out, because I think in that moment, specifically to our movement anyway, in that moment, people suddenly realised that we weren't just fighting a laboratory, we were fighting the British state. And I think people kind of took that on different levels. I think a lot of us thought, this might be a one-off thing and like there's only so much they can do to help, which we obviously got proven quite violently wrong. But from that moment, a lot of people left the movement. Some people became more radical. But really that was 2001 and quite early in the campaign, but really the beginning of the end, a very slow end, but really the beginning of the end of the campaign.
You sort of brush past this detail that I just want to quickly return to. You talked about how the left abandoned you. Can you talk a bit about that and the relationship between this sort of wave of the animal liberation movement and the broader left?
I think the animal liberation movement has always been the kind of or the weird cousin of the rest of the radical left. I think most, certainly not all, I've known some terrible animal rights activists, but a lot of, you said the people I associate within the animal liberation movement are, heavily involved in actions, now for Palestine and environmental actions and the wider radical left. It doesn't always go back the same way, and I think that really comes down to this kind of, I suppose that there's an understandable view that to be involved in animal liberation activism, you have to be vegan. You have to be. It's not like a thing where it's just like, oh, this one issue I kind of like sympathise with. I think people maybe feel kind of ostracised from it, perhaps because they're not. You either commit 100% or you don't commit at all.
Yeah.
And if you start recognising, the sentience and the rights of other animals, then you kind of have to recognise all of them. And that's quite a big step for a lot of people. And a lot of people would rather not really get involved in that. And also, there's certainly been campaigns and individuals within the animal liberation movement that probably haven't helped and haven't done much to kind of ingratiate ourselves in that way. And so I think we've always kind of been a little bit outside of it. And which is a huge shame, and it's something that I've always tried to kind of build those bridges. And at my book launch, I was very keen to invite Palestine Action to come and talk about their campaigning and then how we inspired them and how we can work together. But I think we've always kind of sat on the outskirts a little bit, and certainly as the fist started clenching around us, because it was just against us. And so, they brought out this law that was interfering with the contractual relationships of an animal research organisation, which in some ways kind of a lot of the new Police Crime Sentencing Act, a lot of that already applies if it's targeted against animal testing, but only if it's targeted against animal testing. And so I think people were just quite happy to kind of like step aside and kind of let us deal with it. And we didn't do enough to build that community and build those bonds, and that was certainly on us as well. But I think it's a lesson moving forward for everyone that we are in this together, and what affects one affects all. Because the clampdown that's happening now, a lot of it was inspired by what happened to us. Yeah. And so it seemed at the time it was happening to us in isolation, and certainly because of this narrative the state were weaving, it looked like we were bringing it on ourselves. And so people were like, well, if we don't do that, it won't happen to us. And now we look and it's like, well, now it is happening to everyone. And it's so important that we work together and fight together.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it was like the kind of precursor to the PCSC Act, like you were just mentioning, and a lot of the same kind of clampdown tactics you were the guinea pigs, I suppose, as probably an apt metaphor for some of the kind of more generalised restrictions that have been placed on protests since. I just want to revisit some of these questions of kind of, two things, I guess, parallels between you and the pro-Palestine movement, and specifically around some of the tactics that you're using. It struck me that one of the main tactics that Shaq used in the beginning was to try and encourage investors, shareholders to divest from HLS. And it did actually persuade 250 shareholders to do that and wiped 40% off of its market value in the process. Kind of incredible. I know we're going to talk about some of the movements that you've inspired, but like which movements were inspiring you? And did that include the BDS movement, for example, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement from the Palestinian civil society?
Well, I mean, I know we were very inspired by previous and contemporary protest campaigns, and I think like nothing happens in a vacuum. And alongside Shaq, or certainly the earlier campaigns, Consort and Hillgrove, you had the Newbury bypass and Twyford Down road protest camps, and they were doing similar things to us at around the same time. They were also going after secondary targets and in some cases shareholders. And yes, I think we were inspired by, but also the campaigns in, against apartheid. I think that was a big inspiration. The suffragettes were a huge inspiration. And the civil rights movement in America. We certainly did everything we could to draw inspiration from a wide variety of sources. And Natasha, one of Shaq's founders, I think her bloodline goes directly back to the French Revolution, and I know that was
wow.
I think
nice.
That was a big inspiration for her as well. So we definitely drew that inspiration. I think it's an incredibly important thing to do because we don't live in a vacuum, and a lot of tactics have been tried by other people, and they might not have worked. They might work now. They might have worked then, they might not work now, but I think it's important to look at what other people are doing and have done and see what we can draw. And that was a big inspiration for me to write the book, to be honest, to pass that knowledge and that inspiration down. Because, we pour blood, sweat and tears into this campaign, and hopefully we can save some people a little of that themselves if they draw those lessons.
There was one particular set of tactics which maybe you'd like to mention, which was the secondary targeting, which Shaq really went hard on with HLS. Can you tell us about what secondary targeting is and how Shaq undertook it?
So secondary targeting, or certainly the way we did it, is essentially to identify what companies, in this case Huntingdon Life Sciences, needed to operate, but that didn't need them, and then to essentially convince them to join a boycott. And for us, that was their shareholders, their customers, their suppliers, their banks, their accountants, and it's crazy effective. And by the end of the campaign, Huntingdon had been forced to build their own laundrette, their own crematorium, their own gas supply lines. They'd had to set up their own courier company, their own catering company, and their banking and insurance were both done by the British government. So it was remarkably effective. But those gas supply lines, they had to get fitted as well. The people that installed them then refused to service them, so they became redundant as soon as they built them. So it's a remarkably effective campaigning model. And in terms of the shareholders, their share price plummeted from, it was well over £1 to barely a penny. And it meant they got kicked off the New York Stock Exchange, they were kicked off the London Stock Exchange, they were kicked off the NASDAQ, they were kicked off the pink sheets, and they ended up, I think the grey markets was the lowest you can kind of get. And like you said, I think they described that as the Lonely Hearts column of shares. It's basically impossible to trade on it.
Yeah. I found it quite funny. There's a bit where you talk about one set of secondary targets, I suppose, were HLS's clients, so people who contracted HLS to do animal testing on their behalf. One of them was Shell. And I'm not sure whether you were the originators of the rhyme of Shell and hell, but it does arise. And it's obviously since been adopted by the climate movement. I think it was "Give Shell Hell" was the slogan that you used. But I just found it funny because you target Shell for having HLS test its petro products on rats. Do you ever feel like Shaq was maybe too single-minded in its focus on animal testing? Because I sort of look at that now and I'm like, was there an opportunity to make a broader point about the climate movement? And maybe you did, and I'm just not accurately capturing the nature of that target.
I mean, we did. I remember, I've got a photo somewhere, unless the police destroyed it, but I've got a photo of me somewhere, I think, holding a banner of about Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a land rights activist murdered by Shell. So we did try and marry the two, but yeah, the reason we focused on Shell is probably a little bit cynical. It was entirely cynical, I think. But when the NatWest Bank dropped Huntingdon Life Sciences, one of their senior executives publicly gave the statement saying that at least our name would no longer be on the high street. And I think that really got us thinking, and particularly Greg thinking, that this is vital, that if you want to like tarnish a company's reputation, if you want to let people know what you're doing, then the best way to do that is to drag their name up and down the British high street. And so after that, we started protesting against GlaxoSmithKline because they had, products like Horlicks and Ribena and Lucozade in every supermarket. So we could do protests inside supermarkets and on the high streets and kind of keep that narrative going, even though, it was unlikely GlaxoSmithKline, the largest pharmaceutical company in the UK, were going to ditch Huntingdon Life Sciences because, Glaxo had their own animal testing laboratories. But it kept the narrative there. And then when the Shell stuff came out, they were a softer target than Glaxo. But more importantly, it meant that we could do these very high visibility protests like at their petrol stations, their oil refineries, and just kind of keep it very much in the public zeitgeist with more chance of winning than the Glaxo campaign.
Yeah, I think there's something also to be said for the single-mindedness of it, that, as you say, what inspired activists in the movement was how winnable this fight seemed and how focused and like dogged its kind of, its mission was, that in some ways, that it's very kind of noble to have kind of intersectional campaigns that bring everyone in, but perhaps the most effective campaigns are just like, single issue, let's shut this shit down.
Yeah, I think, you need everything. And I think an effective protest movement has to be a diverse ecosystem. You need the individual change, you need the system change, but you also need the grassroots pressure campaigning, I think. And for me, as, an individual, I don't have any kind of political sway. I think the most empowered I can be is taking power into my own hands. And we demonstrated through Shack just how powerful individuals can be. And individuals with no kind of, higher education or just regular people can go out and quite literally change the world, and so for me that's why I'm always quite a big proponent of pressure campaigning, because a lot of systems change and even sometimes the individual change stuff, it kind of relies on kind of putting your power and your kind of faith and your hope into other people, and while it's important people do that, I think for me, I've been let down so many times, signing petitions, writing to politicians and all the rest of it. And then, I'm hoping that someone's going to do something on my behalf, and they very rarely do. Whereas with this, anyone could just go out and start a pressure campaign and close down whatever companies they wanted. And I think, if you had enough tenacity and innovation, you could go out and close down McDonald's if you wanted to.
Think big, dream big, guys. McDonald's. You heard it here first. It's interesting though, because you talked earlier about how Britain's a nation of animal lovers, and therefore, in order to get sort of public consent for the extremely aggressive way that they were treating you, the British state had to sort of cultivate a narrative around you, through its primary organ, the British media. I think it's particularly shocking given that it's The Guardian, supposedly the more progressive of our mainstream media outlets. But in her Guardian column in 2001, Polly Toynbee published the personal mobile number of Shack activist Greg Avery, one of the co-founders of Shack, as you've said. Was this kind of vindictive behavior typical of the response you were getting from the press? Like, you would not get away with that now. That's just doxing someone in your Guardian column. Like, literally, it's right there on its website, on the Guardian website right now. You can find the article, and his 07 number is right there.
Yeah, it's wild. And yes, it was. And I think this is why we just kind of rolled with it. I think we had for a long time this kind of idea that any publicity is good publicity, and definitely any time we had severe negative publicity, and we had a lot of severe negative publicity, a lot of smear campaigning and lies and planted news and all the rest of it. But every time that happened, our membership increased, our donations increased, and so I think we just kind of got to the point where they're not going to work with us, so we're not going to work with them, and so we got on and did our own thing. And I think in hindsight, it wasn't very helpful that we kind of allowed that narrative. But there really was, it was something that's mentioned a lot in the later trials, about this climate of fear that we created. And certainly the members of the Animal Liberation Front were going out and doing some fairly radical stuff, but also the media and the police were actively pushing this narrative, and there was an anti-animal rights police unit set up, NETCU, the National Extremist Tactical Coordination Unit. And they were part government funded and part privately funded. And some of their funding
like
came...
a militia.
Kind of. But some of their funding, they would go to these companies, pharmaceutical companies, who would pay them for like security training and advice. So one of my friends, her dad actually worked for a pharmaceutical company, not connected to Huntingdon. But they decided to pay for these people to come in and kind of give their spiel. And they played this video of like, bombings and arson attacks. Like virtually none of it was anything to do with animal rights. None of it was from the UK. But they showed this crazy video that
I can just imagine.
Yeah,
and like then, stock footage of someone getting like blown up, and
they were like, and this is what will happen.
Animal liberation activists did this.
But literally, and then this is what will happen if you're, if they start a campaign against you.
Yeah.
Or if you're connected to any of these laboratories or whatever. They literally, and they took my friend's dad aside and was like, look, we know who your daughter is, we know who she's friends with. Like, you want to have a word? And so they were creating a climate of fear very actively, because it meant that then these companies got terrified and would pay them more money to help them up their security and stop this happening. So yeah, it was a kind of a wild time. And I think a lot of it, like I say, we almost kind of gaslit ourselves that this is all just inevitable. And again, it just felt so bizarre that we just kind of didn't really know what to do about it. So we just kind of ignored it and focused on the job in hand.
Yeah. So then we come to Operation Achilles, which is May the 1st, 2007, Operation Achilles. Belgium, the Netherlands, and the UK, 700 cops descend on activist houses and drag them from their beds, arrest them, charge them, etc. How did this come about? How did this coordinated operation come about? Who got arrested for what, including you? And was it the end of Shag?
So it came about, and this is where the other villain of the piece comes in, a guy called Adrian Radford. And his story is, again, it's so bizarre, but he was a data analyst. So essentially he was employed through his company by the Japanese pharmaceutical industry to keep a passive eye on Shaq, so to read our newsletters and our website and any news articles about Shaq, which all fine. That was his job. Nothing really particularly sinister about it. But then at some point, the City of London, a pension fund in the City of London, offered a £25 million reward for any information that would lead to the conviction of animal rights extremists, which is kind of what the government fairly euphemistically described any animal rights activist as.
Yeah.
And suddenly, Adrian Radford leaves his job, and the next time he's seen is at one of our gatherings, where we used to share ideas and tactics and everything. And so he turned up in, pressed chinos and a salmon pink shirt in this muddy field in Kent, loudly proclaiming how ghastly it all was and how muddy it all was, and acting like the antithesis of an undercover cop. And he very quickly made friends with Greg Natasha.
Right.
And he had a background in the military, and which is very open about, but he had been kicked out of the military for his sexuality and then joined Outrage, the gay rights movement, with Peter Tatchell. And so we checked with Peter Tatchell, who's a friend of ours, and he confirmed that, he's got a solid background, there's nothing dodgy about him. So he integrated himself into our campaign. He went round that weekend outing every single undercover cop in the gathering. Like, he would be like, that guy's dodgy, and he would sneak into their tent and pull out their police notebook and show it to everyone and get them kicked out, to the point that the police went to his former employer and told them, you have to get your guy under control, he's ruining all of our operations.
He's ruining the undercover cop.
The former employer was like, he's not my guy, he doesn't work, I don't know where, he's just left and he's gone rogue. And then at some point after that, he obviously then started working directly for the police. But what he had promise, because infiltrating Shaq was as easy as asking if you could help, because we wanted people to help, we weren't doing anything wrong, and we were, to all intents and purposes, a very overt lawful campaign. But he had clearly, I think, promised the police that he was going to infiltrate the Animal Liberation Front, which is a different thing. That's the people that go out and break law for the animal rights movement or animal liberation causes, and generally, these are cells of individuals or close friends or sometimes even family members, and two people in the same town could be in an ALF cell and not even know each other. So what he'd promised was so far from what he was doing, and presumably at some point the pressure started coming on, when are you going to give us information about the Animal Liberation Front? So rather than actually trying to infiltrate the Animal Liberation Front, he just found 2 new activists and convinced them to come and raid a chicken farm with him.
Brilliant.
And
Just the three of them?
Just the 3 of them.
Nice.
They got 9 chickens in what, from all accounts, was an absolute bungled operation. But from this bungled operation, a few months later, him and his 2 new friends...
It was Chicken Run. But I guess the heroes were the humans. But anyway, it's fine.
He was not a hero.
The heroes were the chickens, I'm sure.
The other 2, I'm sure, him not a hero. But a few months later, the 3 of them went out and in one night wrote off 14 vehicles connected to people involved in the import and export of laboratory animals. And we don't know what happened in between this bungled chicken operation and this fairly kind of militarized, like, writing off of 14 vehicles on people's driveways in the middle of the night. But presumably there was some kind of build up to that, and presumably he was doing other actions in the meantime. But according to him, in interviews he did with Dutch TV, he helped research the targets, he bought the equipment used in the attacks, he drove the getaway vehicle, and the police selected the targets. And amongst the targets was a lady called Margaret Ewing, who was head of or CEO of Heathrow Airport, where a lot of animals were coming in and out of for the research industry. And in Adrian's words, the police selected her to make it political, because when things become political, people start to get rounded up. A few months after that, he vanished, feigning a terminal illness. And then May 1st, 2007, 32 people are dragged from their beds and arrested by the police.
So he's like an agent provocateur,
I mean, I think beyond that, he's absolutely like a rogue agent. I've spoken to, people who are professionals in this industry, like undercover cops and professional spies, and they say, like, this doesn't happen. The police don't operate like this, but they do. Like, we got blatant black and white evidence. This is what happened.
So he was being instructed by the police, or he had gone rogue. The police said do this, and he did something completely different.
So he went rogue. He was then employed by the police as an informant.
Okay.
How far he followed what they told him to do, we don't know, and the police won't tell us. The CPS won't tell us.
But he was a kind of chaos agent, whether that was on his own steam or clearly with some instruction from the police, that then kind of justified this enormous, clampdown in the form of Operation Achilles. They were like, right, that's it. It's game over.
Exactly. And this is, the police and the CPS to this day refuse to confirm or deny the level of his involvement, their connection to him, what they instructed, what they did. So we don't know. And this is really, there should be a government inquiry into what he was doing, I think. But hopefully we'll get there one day. But, the first step is hopefully getting some appeals for people based on the fact that, because what we were arrested for initially.
How many of you were there arrested?
So there's 32 arrested.
Yeah.
Greg, Natasha, Heather were all remanded for conspiracy to commit blackmail.
And this was really novel at the time, right? This was the first time that political activists were charged with blackmail, which is what most people think of as like, I tell you to do something unreasonable or I'll do something menacing to you.
Right. We were the second, and the first was the New Church Guinea Pig campaign.
Okay.
3 activists from that have been arrested and convicted of blackmail.
But so the Animal Liberation Movement was the first.
Yeah, for sure, the Animal Liberation. But in their case, like, what they were accused of and what they were convicted of were kind of different things, and it all got very messy. But one of the incidents up there, I think most people kind of recognised why it was being treated as a blackmail. With us, it was the first time that kind of protest, what most people I think would view as legitimate protest in many cases, was being treated as blackmail. Because under British law, blackmail is making an unwarranted demand with a menace. And so what they were saying was our unwarranted demand was stop dealing with this laboratory, and our menace was, or else we'll put you on our website and then other people might do something bad to you.
Oh, God forbid you'll be on their website. But
which is any campaign. Literally any campaign could be like dragged into this, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, any campaign has a demand and leverage. Like we're seeing, whilst we're recording this, there's a liberation camp outside on the campus of Columbia University, and they have a demand, which is Columbia divest from these 8 companies that abet Israeli apartheid, or will continue being on your lawn. Theoretically, under British law and this interpretation, or English and Welsh law, that could be blackmail.
Exactly. And I think it's a terrifying precedent. And so we thought initially that this wasn't going anywhere. So we said the 3 founders were remanded to prison. A group of people close to so I think the people the police thought most likely to take over running Shack. And again, so this wasn't about what people had done. This was very much about the threat that they might keep running the campaign, and a campaign that by this point was overtly lawful, that, you know, as I said, had disclaimers in all our websites and newsletters, and had like legal monitors on all our protests. We arranged all our protests with the police. So this wasn't about what anyone had done. It didn't matter what people had done. It mattered whether they might keep this campaign alive. And then my partner and I and a group of others were bailed but not charged. And so we thought that, you know, this was ridiculous. It was, for want of a better phrase, a fishing expedition, and that this would all kind of blow over fairly quickly, that Greg, Natasha, Heather would get out of prison, they would take back over Shaq. And so in the interim, we kind of agreed to step up and just kind of keep things ticking over because we didn't have charges. 6 months later, we got raided again and were charged.
With what?
Conspiracy to commit blackmail. And then there's a whole other story. They kept raiding us, and yeah, there's a lot there. It's in my in my book. I won't bore everyone with all the ins and outs here.
It is fascinating,
and
I do recommend you all go and read it.
But so they kept raiding us basically, and then we got dragged into this and taken out, and then the next wave of people that stepped up to take over the campaign, again, even more lawful than before, they got taken out, and then the next wave got taken out, and, you know, it got to the point where it just became literally impossible. But yeah, and so some people ended up being charged, you know, in kind of plea bargains and stuff with that interfering with contractual relationships of an animal research organisation law, which I wish they had made easier to say because it's quite a mouthful. But and the rest of us were convicted or, you know, charged and convicted with blackmail.
And you were sentenced to 5 years in HMP Winchester, and you served 2. Am I right?
Yeah, so I did 3.5 years on bail beforehand.
Okay.
The last year, because of another police informant, which is in the book, I had electronic tag on. Then I served 2 years in Winchester, and then 2.5 years on licence, which is probably worse than prison.
Why is that?
So I think in prison, you have a release date, and like the worst that's going to happen is going to happen. So you can just kind of get about making a life. And you can just kind of deal with the, you know, the hand you've been dealt, and, you know, find a way through. And, you know, I'm a fairly positive person, so I was able to make friends and, you know, get qualifications and do the gardening and whatever else. So it was kind of fine. I was fine in prison. You know, I don't want to say I enjoyed it, but bits I said, you know, I was happy a lot. But when you get out on license, you can, you know, the police can recall you essentially for anything, like any perceived breach of license conditions, they can just take you straight back to prison, and then you have to argue it from prison. And so my partner, she had another kind of wild story, but basically the police were really unhappy with the length of her sentence, how short it was relatively to what they'd hoped. And so they, a made-up police officer from Kent Police, who doesn't exist, phoned up her probation and said that she had breached her probation. Her probation sent a local cop to come and check that she was staying at her mum's house where she was licensed to. He came, confirmed everything was fine, and someone changed his statement. We don't know who, but like we have like the black and white copy of the statement and a letter from him saying that's not what I wrote. So someone changed his statement, and she was taken out of her mum's house while she was baking some cakes for her friend's staff do, and recalled to prison, and then spent the next couple of months trying to fight it. And like parole board decisions going missing, and her lawyers. Yeah, it was really dodgy. And so I came out just after all this had happened with 2.5. You know, she was only on license for a few months. I was on license for 2.5 years, and every single day I was just waiting for them to come and recall me for something I hadn't done, which is a lot more stressful than just being in prison and getting on with your life, I think. Because you can't do anything. You're just waiting for it to end.
And obviously there were also some terms of your release as well, and a number of Shaq activists that you weren't allowed to participate, and perhaps still aren't allowed to participate in some of the animal liberation work that got you imprisoned in the first place. And you talk about living in perpetual states of fear when you're on license. Like, has this experience made you sort of politically, inactive, I suppose?
I mean, I'm here.
Yeah.
So not enough, I guess, from their point of view. But it definitely it definitely threw a curveball into my life. I think the life I'm living isn't the one I predicted I'd be living. And as I said, Lord Sainsbury, I got minutes from these secret government meetings that were supposed to be redacted. Whoever was redacting them did a terrible job, and I was able to unredact them. And in that is where Lord Sainsbury says he has this 5-strand plan to eradicate our movement. And I still haven't found out what each of the 5 strands were, but, I can make a good guess at some of them. But that's kind of what they did. They took out the New Church campaign, then they took out the Sequani campaign, which is a completely lawful protest campaign. And their key organizer was sentenced for 4 years in prison for that stupid animal testing law. And he eventually got he was in prison, I think, for 16 months before he got his conviction quashed because there was literally no crime had happened throughout the whole campaign. And then they came for the Shack campaign, and then they went for the Speak campaign, who were trying to stop a laboratory being built in Oxford. And then the police moved to Austria and tried to take out the Austrian campaign. And before that, they'd been all through North America, there's the United States and Canada, eradicating Shack over there. So when I came out of prison, the movement that I'd grown up in just didn't exist anymore. Like, it had root and branch been removed. And so it was very odd. And a lot of the activism that, a lot of my friends have been to prison for liberating animals from laboratories or whatever else. And they would come out and they'd be like, I'll do some kind of softer stuff while I kind of fire my feet again, maybe outreach stalls or leafleting or, soft protests. But that was the stuff we went to prison for. These outreach tools, like the fundraising, the peaceful protests, that's what we went to prison for. So nothing felt safe. And even if it had, there was nothing to join. And so if I wanted to do anything like what we've been doing before, I'd have to start it myself. And obviously, if I did that, I'd immediately get dragged back to prison. So it definitely took a while to kind of find, I still don't know if I fully have, but kind of where I fit into the modern movement. Because, there is a resurgent animal rights movement at the moment, but it's kind of more born out of the environmental movement.
Yes.
It's a lot of the new activists don't even know what happened to us or that we even existed. So obviously, I kind of want to pass this knowledge on to them as well as other progressive movements. But yeah, I'm still kind of finding my place back in it, I think. But it's an interesting experience.
Who do you see as your inheritors, as Shack's inheritors? Because it feels like, we could talk about the animal rights movement, but you've also briefly touched on Palestine Action, who, I wrote a piece about this some time ago. Their activists are currently on trial for conspiracy to blackmail, and we've covered some of that trial, and it's only the second time, or the third, I suppose, if you think about the guinea pig farm as the first, and then Shack as the second, and so they're the third. This is only the third time that blackmail has been used against activists. Do you see groups like Palestine Action with their kind of secondary targeting and their militancy? They go in and smash up Israeli arms companies and factories around the UK, as well as the properties of their landlords, etc. Or do you sort of see yourself more kind of aligned with and sort of a sense of kinship with the sort of animal rights movement as it exists today, people like the XR offshoot, Animal Rising, and so on?
It's definitely no secret that Palestine Action are actively informed by and inspired by what Shack did. The 2 of their founders were involved in the Shack campaign, and to varying levels, and they are drawing direct inspiration. And like I say, they came to my book launch because they are really the most overt inheritors of the Shack model and the Shack campaign. So yeah, 100% they are. I think what they're doing that's very interesting and is what is different from us is, we kept Shack and the Animal Liberation Front as 2 separate things, as much as the state tried to kind of conflate them and ultimately, convince the jury they were conflated.
The non-violent Shack and the sort of violent Animal Liberation Front.
The Animal Liberation Front has a policy of non-violence. I think it comes down to whether you view property damage as violent. But yeah, certainly the lawful Shack and the unlawful Animal Liberation Front.
Right, okay, that's a better distinction, yeah.
Whereas Palestine Action have kind of merged the two, and I suppose that part of what they're doing is more inspired by the XR kind of model of very accountable actions of you're breaking it and you're not denying you broke it, but there's a good reason, and that's inspired more by XR. So they've kind of conflated the two themselves and made, because direct action is a vital part of effective protest, and to kind of own that, I think, so I don't know if I'd ever have been brave enough to do that, but to own that kind of necessity for direct action, the necessity and the immediacy that's required to end these things, I think is incredibly powerful. And it's interesting how it's playing out. A lot of people are getting acquittals because they are justified in what they're doing.
Yeah, and because juries see that, right?
Exactly. And, it goes back to the whole nation of animal lovers thing. Like, I think most people like to see themselves as decent people. And when they're, confronted with, is this justified? This is what's happening. I think, fortunately, the public isn't quite as terrible as the media would make us think sometimes, I think.
It's interesting. This is maybe more a philosophical question than a tactical one, but you've kind of touched on this briefly earlier in the conversation about the kind of value of animal life and that being your moral conviction, and that's what drove you to sort of join the animal liberation movement. And also about taking inspiration from civil rights movements. Do you see Shaq now, looking back on it, as more part of, the kind of environmental and climate movement, or as actually more akin to a civil rights movement? Because to me, it sort of reminds me a lot of the sort of things that you and activists in Shaq say in your book. I think there was one person who described themselves as feeling ashamed to be human when they saw what was going on at Huntingdon Life Sciences. It actually reminds me a lot of the pro-Palestine movement and the way that we've seen it mobilize in response to the genocide in Gaza currently. A genocide which philosophically relies entirely on the degradation of Palestinian life. We see them described as human animals. Now, I mean, it's I suppose probably interesting to you to think, well, even if they were animals, should we be treating them like that? And is there something actually quite philosophically confluent about about Shaq and the anti-vivisection movement and the animal liberation movement and a human rights movement, in that both are attempting to convey the fundamental equality of living beings?
Well, I mean, humans are animals, primarily. And so any animal liberationist really should also value human life as well as non-human life. And I think we always have viewed ourselves as, a civil rights movement. I think all animals, humans and otherwise, we are all individuals with our own wants and needs. And there's no branch of science, I don't think, that can suggest or provide any evidence that suggests that another animal experiences the world wildly differently to how any of us do. And so for me, when we talk about these issues and the rights of animals, I call myself an animal liberationist. I don't really understand who gets to confer rights onto others. But when we think of these other animals, like experiencing slaughterhouses or vivisection laboratories or intensive farm or any kind of farming really, and just being oppressed by humans, there's nothing in science that suggests that we would experience that wildly differently to how they do. And so then just to kind of for a moment put yourself in the position of that pig about to enter a slaughterhouse and hearing its family and friends being violently killed and knowing what's coming and, already having led this horrible confined life of violence and fear. And the same with animals in laboratories who are experimented to death, like just being slowly poisoned on weed killer. Like, if there's no reason for me to assume that their experience of that is wildly differently from mine, how could I possibly be part of inflicting that on them? And how could I not be outraged and horrified and ashamed to be human that so many people think that's acceptable and normal? So yeah, I think that's kind of where I come from on it.
Yeah, but it's kind of confronting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people on the left might think, like, how have we let ourselves get to a point where we can treat this group of people worse than that group of people? But I suppose what you're saying is that, like, the animal liberation movement, which as we'll maybe talk about, has become much more marginal, I think, in the kind of left, has been saying for decades, well, we already treat, and many of us who consider ourselves to be progressives, uphold a violent hierarchy of living beings in our day-to-day lives, and we completely take it for granted. We wear leather shoes, and
when we shoot someone in the head for a sandwich, and it's fine, and you can joke about it on social media, and it's fine, and everyone has to laugh.
Yeah, and that there's like a disconnect. Is it even like possible that we'll ever resolve the kind of the fundamental kind of cognitive dissonances that allow Israeli soldiers to treat Palestinian lives as less valuable than Israeli lives or Jewish lives, if we don't resolve the cognitive dissonance that allows us to treat a cow's life or a cat's life or a dog's life different to a human life.
Yeah, I mean, there's the famous Gandhi quote, isn't there? I can't remember what it is, but the greatness of a nation can be judged by how it treats its animals, something like that. Well, not Gandhi, but something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know how we'll ever resolve that until we can recognise it. And I think this is why historically the animal liberation movement has always been kind of slightly removed from the rest of the radical left, because what most progressive causes are asking of people, like actually asking of people, is very small. Like whether it's, the right to marry, you're just asking people to be a little bit more tolerant. And even the civil rights movement, like the actual changes individuals have to make are very small. Like is, letting different people into your business or, removing certain barriers and things. Whereas what the animal liberation movement is asking and necessitates is people to start questioning and changing what they eat, what they wear, how they draw their entertainment, where they work, how they work. And, it's literally like upending all of society, because society is underpinned by the exploitation and oppression of other animals. And that's such a big ask that I think, if you want to become involved in the environmental movement, kind of, getting your clothes from a thrift store or Vinted or whatever, or like, using less plastic bottles, they're not huge changes. But, have to think about where you go out to eat and what you eat. And for a lot of people, that feels at least like a huge upending. And so
of their lives. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's actually like a higher threshold to entry, which I think is kind of related to what you were saying earlier about people feeling like maybe the animal liberation movement is too puritanical or something, or that it requires a lot more of them, because to some extent it does.
It does ultimately. I don't personally think it's a higher threshold to entry. I think, I went hunt sabbing when I was 15. I was vegetarian.
What's hunt sabbing?
Stopping hunts from killing foxes, essentially. So I started that when I was 15, and I was vegetarian, but I still wore leather shoes, and I still consumed eggs and dairy and probably gelatin because I didn't know what it was. And over time, I kind of became more aware of other issues and kind of immersed myself more and more into it all. And so I don't think there's necessarily this barrier to entry. I think it's just a perceived barrier that people are kind of like, well, I'm not vegan, so I can't be part of this. Whereas actually, because it's such a huge change that needs to happen in society, you almost need to just pull yourself slightly out of it, or be pulled slightly out of it, so that you can kind of more objectively see what you're a part of.
Yeah.
Because it's horrific. Like the volume of like other animals that are being slaughtered just for food is like, if you include fish, I think if we killed humans at the same rate, we'd be extinct in 3 seconds. It's something mad like that. And yeah, and then, there's more farmed animals on this planet than there are humans and other mammals combined.
Wow. So
to kind of be part of something that's so catastrophically and humongously violent and depraved and evil, you can't really acknowledge it when you're in the heart of it. And when the people you care about and the people you love, your parents, your friends, are part of it. So you kind of almost need just a kind of little nudge out of it so you can start objectively thinking about it. And once you start framing it like, why is this different from violence towards other humans? Like what, if we're saying that we're like progressive and we're deep thinking people, there's nothing, like literally nothing that suggests a cow or a pig or a dog doesn't suffer, doesn't feel pain.
In the same way.
Doesn't feel excitement and joy and sadness and all the rest of it. So what is the justification for it? And so that's why we kind of need, I think, as well, these campaigns, stopping animals being tested on. That's an easy thing for people to start thinking about and get active for. And then you can start thinking about these other things once you start connecting those dots.
Yeah. It's interesting, there was a beagle liberation not so long ago by Animal Rising. But, you speak to a lot of environmental and climate campaigners now, and they'll tell you, and probably you'll tell me, that anti-vivisection campaigning in particular is quite marginal nowadays in the kind of animal liberation movement compared to, say, anti-blood sport campaigning or anti-farming. What happened to the sort of movement against animal testing and vivisection on animals? And, is it was Operation Achilles kind of solely to blame?
I certainly, that is Operation Achilles and the other events in my book are to blame for the ending of that. I mean, that period of animal liberation from 1960 something to 2014. But the anti-blood sports campaigning has been fairly consistent for a very long time. Like throughout the events of this book, it kind of carried on doing its own thing. Hunt saboteurs and anti-badger cull activists just kind of kept doing what they were doing. But I think when I became involved in the late 90s, animal testing felt like something we were going to win. Because it's so archaic, like it doesn't work. I think there's a fairly recognized statistic that 95% of drugs that are pass safe in non-human animals fail human clinical trials, which is terrible. You might as well just flip a coin. And so why does this happen? Obviously, it all comes down to money and being able to manipulate data very easily through animal models, which allows toxic products to be released onto market. So it is archaic. It does need to be ended. It feels like it should. It still feels like it should be ended fairly imminently. I'm sure it will be at some point. So it felt winnable, and other things like fox hunting felt very winnable, and the fur issues felt very winnable. Animal agriculture did not feel winnable because we were like a minority, and we were very like publicly decried as a kind of cranky minority. When I came out of prison and shortly after that, a few years after that, and we see the rebirth of the animal liberation movement, the new modern animal liberation movement with groups like DXE and Animal Rising and
DXE stands for
Direct Action Everywhere.
Okay.
Animal Rising and those kind of groups, they were more inspired by the environmental movement, as I say, but because they're inspired by the environmental movement, they're obviously going after animal agriculture, which is one of the largest contributors to climate change. And it's an obvious thing and kind of coupled perhaps fortuitously with the rise of vegan capitalism and then movements like Meat Free Mondays and Veganuary. It's had like such a huge impact on our attitudes towards the consumption of other animals that suddenly like I'm in this weird place, or certainly was a couple of years ago, in this weird place where it suddenly felt like animal agriculture, like one of the biggest businesses on the planet, felt like it might be able to be toppled. And vivisection felt like a lost cause. Now I think there has been a bit of a resurgence, like you say, Animal Rising liberating the dogs from MBR acres and Camp Beagle that's been there for a few years. I think we're still missing the pressure campaigning. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same as how Shaq did it, but Palestine Action showed another way of doing it, and there's been plenty of other campaigns that have followed a similar model and kind of avoided the confrontational side of it. Like even, the fossil fuel treaty even kind of follows a very similar model to Shaq, albeit without the confrontation. So yeah, it'd be nice to kind of see the grassroots kind of picking up the pressure campaigning in the vivisection field, but it does feel winnable again. I think it's back on the political agenda. It's back on the scientific agenda. I saw Charles River just a few days ago put out a statement saying that they were investing more in non-animal models to kind of push towards a reduction of animal testing. And they're one of the biggest animal research companies. Now, I don't like, if you actually read into it, it doesn't actually seem like they're decreasing the use of animals. They're just increasing the use of other things to make more money. But the fact they felt they had to put out this statement kind of demonstrates that even the big players in this field are starting to feel the pressure back on them, and because all they need is a spotlight on them. They're terrified of scrutiny, and if we ever do have our public inquiry into whether animal testing works, that will end the industry. So they're terrified of scrutiny, and so I can see it being winnable again.
Yeah. If you were to do this all over again, if you had the opportunity to sort of rewind and go again, what would you do differently? I feel like this is quite a nice way to close our conversation, because so much of this book is a lesson for activists, I think.
So it's a hard one, because if I went back and did it all again, I'd probably just do the same thing again. I think we were just, we were doing this 24/7, and we were literally waking up and just focusing on the campaign and then going to sleep and kind of rinse and repeat. And so I don't know if there's anything specific that I would have had time to do differently. There are things that, we probably should have done differently. Like I think we could have, built our, the coalition building would have been very helpful. And that's certainly something I recommend other people do. I think there were times we maybe should have taken our foot off the pedal and took a breath and just kind of checked where we were and where things were heading. But we kept going right up until, like, for me, I was literally like dragged out of the campaign and thrown into prison, always literally, like right up to the end, because it felt like we were going to win. Even after, people were going to prison, being remanded and sentenced and convicted, right up to the end, it felt like we were going to win. And I think it was that kind of like, one of us is going to fold, and who's it going to be? So I don't know if I'd change anything.
Yeah, it is so inspiring. And honestly, like, I think if it weren't for probably Lord Sainsbury, you very well might have won. The state might have thought it just wasn't worth its while to, like, underwrite this failing business.
If it wasn't for Lord Sainsbury's, we'd have won within a year of the campaign in 2001. But also Adrian Radford. So the conspiracy to blackmail was making unwarranted demand with menace. There was only one example of that given in the prosecution case statement, and it was a phone call that was attributed to Greg Avery. He pleaded guilty shortly after that. But I got hold of the tapes last year, and it's very clearly Adrian Radford, the undercover police agent who made these threatening phone calls. So presumably Greg is, he's not talking to anyone at the minute. I imagine there's a lot going on there, but presumably he pleaded guilty to protect a friend that he believed was dying. But yeah, so the entire blackmail conspiracy wouldn't have existed if Adrian Radford hadn't made, presumably on the say-so of the cops, made the threatening phone calls. So, so without Adrian Radford and Lord Sainsbury's, who knows where
you would be
prison for something else.
Yeah, prison for something else instead. Oh, Tom, it's been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for being our guest on Novara FM.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.